Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Learning Assessment Proof Points, brought to you by the PSA Project Management Committee as part of PSA's Project Management Appreciation Month. Today's webinar will discuss different methods for assessing your technician skill set, a responsibility that often falls to the project manager. Our guest speaker today is Connie Moorhead, President of the Seymour Group and Security CEU. For the past 15 years, Connie has helped business owners develop profitable training programs and has served as the Ask the Expert columnist for Security Dealer and Integrator magazine and frequently contributes to several key publications in the industry. A few things before we get started. If at any time you experience technical difficulties during today's presentation, please contact us via the chat box located in your GoToWebinar drop-down menu, and we will get you up and running in no time. Also, you'll notice that there's a questions box where you can submit any questions, and all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Connie. Connie?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer said, my name is Connie Moorhead, and I'm the president of the Seymour Group. And today we'll take about 30 minutes just to talk about learning assessments and how they can be applied to your jobs in taking the technician and trying to gain a little bit of understanding on what their skill sets are. So what I'll cover today is some detail on checking background knowledge and really looking at those knowledge gaps and how to bridge those gaps. And we'll look at different inventories and surveys that you can use to do that, measuring learning during and after an event, and then we'll talk about rubrics as well, and I'll explain what those are and how to use them. So I like to keep things a little lighthearted while I'm doing a presentation, so you'll see some different cartoons throughout. And this one simply is trying to talk about, regardless of what Dad does on his own self-assessment, it's wrong. And the point of this is, quite frankly, a lot of times when we do a self-assessment, we don't have the ability to, or we might have the ability to assess what our own knowledge is, but it may not be as accurate as if it's assessed by a professional, by the project manager, by the instructional design team, what have you. So we're going to talk about different ways to do more professional assessments than just the standard self-assessment. The first thing we want to do is really kind of walk through with the technician and check their background knowledge. And doing so, as far as why we do this, is really targeted in a lot of learning theories and research into the process. So determining what the technician already knows allows us to do a couple of things. First, we can target specific knowledge gaps, so where they're at, where they need to go, and that gap is often called a gap analysis, and how we can bridge that gap. We can become more aware of the diversity of the backgrounds that are in our classroom or vying for the different jobs and projects that we're teaching. Create a bridge between the tech's previous knowledge and the new material, and then finally check for misconceptions as well that could hinder learning any new material. So for the technician themselves, understanding their starting point will make it easier for them to see what they have learned by the end. So we want to always keep them in tune with what we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, etc. Okay, so when it comes to actually planning the assessment, we begin by doing a couple of things. We ask questions. So what do we assume the techs already know? What kinds of questions will help confirm our assumptions? What are some of the common misconceptions or myths related to our subject? And then how are we going to analyze and respond to the data that our pre-assessment provides? So it's kind of where we're at, where we need to be, and how we get there. And this is really just talking about the idea of using any standard form. So we're saying in a classroom of people, we've been in here all year long, we've taught you to think for yourselves, we've paced your own personal style, I've set goals for each of you individually, and then we're going to test that with a standardized test. So the idea is really that being able to assess a student's knowledge based on their individual needs and individual job tasks is the most effective. Some of the things that I will talk about next are some of the different strategies. and that includes just a common sense inventory, a background knowledge probe, a gallery walk, minute papers, and quizzes. So I just want to give you all a high-level view of what each of these are, rather than walking step by step through how to do each one. So the common sense paper, for instance, is really just making a list of 10 to 15 statements related to content or the learning task, and then have the technicians mark true or false next to each statement, and that's really all that it is. The background knowledge probe is preparing 2 or 3 open-ended or multiple choice questions, and then we write the questions on the board or on a piece of paper and give it to the technician and ask them to respond in a 2 or 3 sentence answer to each question, or they could circle a response if the responses are provided for them. In a gallery walk, we do what you may have seen in classrooms a lot, placing the images or graphs or excerpts from an upcoming course around the middle of a poster board or poster paper, and then hang those around a room, create groups of 2 to 4 technicians per group, and have one group in front of each poster paper, and give them a few minutes to write observations and evaluations about those subject matters on that poster board, and then we simply review themes for comments, and that gives us an idea of where those students are at and where they need to go. The minute paper is a very popular way to assess knowledge, in that we take and decide what prior knowledge is necessary for the technician to do their job. And then we write 1 or 2 questions that hits on the above, on that idea of what they need, and then try answering it ourselves, of course, to see where we're at, and then setting aside maybe 5 to 10 minutes of classroom time to use the minute paper, and simply handing out index cards or hash sheets of paper, and ask the technician to do this anonymously, so not write their name on it, but let the technician know that they have 2 to 3 minutes per question, and that they should write short answers, words or short sentences, and then we provide feedback on that. So one of the things we want to make sure we're doing is knowing how we measure success, and there's some considerations we need to keep in mind. When using any sort of background knowledge assessment, it's important that we communicate that the assessment is not graded, as well as do not require the technician to put their name on it, so we want to make it anonymous. And then we can use technology as well, such as Blackboard or Qualtrics or some sort of classroom response system that will quantify some of the data that is being provided to us. And then we can provide graphs and charts and information and share that with the technician as well. And then, of course, taking the assessment ourselves can confirm that it makes sense and that the questions are appropriate. Now, when it comes to measuring the actual student learning or technician learning, we have 4 different ways that I've listed out here that we can do that. There's summative and formative assessments, and then indirect and direct. And I want to talk a little bit more depth about each of these, because I think they're most appropriate for what we're trying to do in the realm of project management. So any assessment is really just a systematic collection of information, and in this case it's about the technician, their learning, their knowledge, their expertise, any resources available or that need to be made available. And so there's several ways that we can do that, and then in turn affect technician learning. So the summative assessment is really just a test or a quiz or other graded activities that are used to measure performance. So let's talk a little bit more about the summative assessment. All right. Now, the summative assessment is cumulative, and will often reveal what the technicians have learned at the end of a course. So within a course, the summative assessment often includes a system for calculating individual grades, and then we can use that to know where they're at, where they need to be, and how we get them there. The formative assessment, on the other hand, is in contrast to the summative assessment, and it's any means by which the technician receives input and guiding feedback on their relative performance to help them improve, and this is absent their grade. The formative assessment can be provided in a number of different ways. It can be face-to-face or in written comments, on papers, projects, problem sets that deal with the installation they're doing, or even through email. The formative assessment can be used to measure the technician's learning on a daily or ongoing basis, so it's not cumulative. And these are assessments that reveal how and what the technicians are learning during the education process, and will often inform us of the next steps that need to be taken in the learning process. Now, this is a matrix that will provide just a high-level overview of what the formative assessment accomplishes and how it's implemented. So the formative assessment is not a one-time thing. It is actually a process that takes place. They're very planned as opposed to unplanned, and they use evidence to make instructional adjustments and or verify learning. And then there is no grading. They involve more individual specific feedback that is turned into an action. Now, this is a very detailed method for how we would use formative assessment, and the idea can be summarized in just a few steps, though. So we look at the summative assessment more from learning progressions, and then that turns into the learning goals where we're defining some success criteria. It then elicits the evidence of instructional modification, so what we actually need to teach, where those knowledge gaps are at, and they can be self or peer assessments, and they provide a lot of descriptive feedback. Now, the direct and indirect assessments are great ways to actually gain information by surveying the technician as well. So for the indirect assessment, we can ask technicians to report on their own learning, and when they do that, that is just in and of itself an indirect assessment. So we ask the technician to rate their knowledge on a topic after taking a course, or as compared to what they believe they already know, would be an example of an indirect assessment. And on the other hand, on the contrary, a direct assessment is an assessment where we assess the technician's direct application of knowledge or skill. I find these to be a little more substantial, because it is talking about not just what they know, but how they can apply it. Then with some examples of direct assessments, we would be looking at how the technician has the ability to summarize a process or apply a theory, solve a problem, synthesize something that they've perhaps read or saw. And so those are ways that we can do both direct and indirect assessments. And really what this is meant to say is that, you know, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So the idea, again, being for different varying students or technicians, it's not necessarily appropriate to test them all the same way because of their learning abilities. Now, some considerations with the summative and formative and direct and indirect assessments is that we can use any of them and all of them for a more comprehensive approach. And we look at kind of 5 things, or a 5-part process when we're talking about measuring. So we look at outcomes. So what do we want technicians to know or be able to do or value as a result of this learning need? Then we identify where is it in the curriculum that these outcomes are addressed, and then measure, and that's where we come in with our assessments. Measure, so we tell how well a technician is achieving these outcomes, and then we go into a revision and remeasure mode. We can include indirect and direct assessments as well as the formative and summative, and evaluate whether or not the assessment aligns directly or indirectly with learning outcomes, and make sure that the measurement is sustainable in terms of time and resources. Now, we want to talk about rubrics, and what I try to do is share with you not only what they are, but I'll share with you how we develop them. So rubrics are not, for those of you fans of the movie industry, they're not rubric, they are rubrics, and they are a scoring guide that assesses and articulates specific components and expectations for an assignment. So in a nutshell, a rubric is a type of scoring guide that we can use for a variety of assignments, such as group projects or portfolios or presentations. So why we use rubrics? They help both the instructor and the student, the technician, understand several things. The instructor gets the ability to assess assignments consistently from tech to tech. They save time in grading, both short-term and long-term, and they give timely, effective feedback and promote the technician learning in a very sustainable way. They also can clarify for the instructor or project manager the expectations and components of an assignment for both techs and presenters in the classroom or the person running the assessment or providing the rubric. And then we can, of course, refine our teaching skills based on the results of those rubrics. The rubrics help the students and the technician do some things as well. First, they are able to understand expectations and components of an assignment and become more aware of their learning process and the progress they're making, and then improve work through timely and detailed feedback. So when we're talking about getting started and developing a rubric, the first thing to remember is to start small. By creating maybe one rubric for one assignment in one course or for one project. And then I like to go ask colleagues if they have developed rubrics for any similar events. And then, although it takes time to definitely build the rubric up front, time will be saved in the long run, because grading and providing feedback on the technician's work will become a lot more streamlined. So this is just talking about the idea of how I would never give my students rubrics. That's equivalent to cheating. I might as well write their essays for them. Students should be able to understand that they're expected to perform. The point of learning is to keep them guessing, so they'll work harder, etc., etc. Stress facilitates success. And then she says, besides, if I gave them a rubric, I'd have to admit that I decide their grades with a dartboard. So the idea here being that rubrics really give us a good path of learning, a starting place, how to get there, and a good end result. Now, when we're developing the rubric, we can use several guidelines to help us understand what we're doing. First, we would examine an assignment for our course and then outline the elements or critical attributes to be developed. So these would be attributes that must be objectively measurable. Then create an evaluative range, such as excellent, good, and satisfactory, or some other evaluative range. And then reinforce a development approach by the technicians by using a developmental scale, such as beginning, emerging, and exemplary, or something along those lines. And then finally, we assign a numerical scale to each level and give a draft of the rubric to our colleagues to review as well. And then finally, train technicians how to use the rubric and rework it based on any feedback we get. Now, a couple of things that I like to keep in mind is that a rubric can be any sort of like fillable PDF, or can be handed to the technician directly, or even emailed to them. And we do need to keep in mind how much time is taken to use the rubric. Okay, so when we use the rubric itself, and I've got a sample one that's here that I'll share with you in just a moment, they can be used for oral presentations. They can be used for the contribution to group tasks, and they can facilitate peer review by setting some evaluation standards, as well as the technician can use them for self-assessment, and the technician can use the rubric for peer assessment. And they're really a great way to motivate the technician to improve their work by using the feedback feature of the rubric. So a simple strategy for introducing the rubrics to the technicians would be to simply provide samples of how they're done. And I have a rubric sample here. Now this one is in particular on like building an online learning classroom methodology. But you can see that I've got my evaluative range of baseline, effective, and exemplary. And under category 1, I'm talking about learning support and resources. So my baseline, for instance, might be contains content on a limited information level for the learner and support and links to campus resources. And then the more effective would be to have a course that contains adequate information, and then exemplary would be to have a course that contains extensive information about being an online learner. So I'm just taking each of my assessment points and providing a baseline, effective, and exemplary range, and then I can have the technician determine in a more formal environment what their needs are. So we only have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to open it up to questions and also provide you my contact information. If you have any questions about today's event, Jennifer, are you going to open it up for that?
Yes, we would take questions at this time. I do have a couple that were submitted, but of course, if after the presentation you'd like to reach out to Connie, we encourage you to do that. Her contact information is listed there as well. But Connie, one of the questions that I received was, our company considers every project as a learning opportunity, and our team often holds lesson learned meetings after a project. Do you recommend assessments for these sessions, and if so, what type of assessment should we implement?
Okay, that's a great question, because the person that submitted that is exactly right. Every project is a learning opportunity. I would at least do review assessments after the projects, but certainly you have a great opportunity here to bridge more, to do more of a gap analysis and bridge more learning. So I would do more of the formative assessment, and I would ask this person too if they're, what are they using today? Rubrics or their own form of assessments, indirect or direct, anything we talked about on the presentation, because enhancing that might be a simpler process than creating a new assessment. So I'd love to talk to that person, but
okay. All right, and then given what you just said, Connie, could they treat projects as courses when developing the rubrics then?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about the sample rubric that I put up, absolutely. The sample rubric that you got to understand that I come from an environment of developing training for the security industry. And so we build a lot of custom online courses, and we have a lot of industry courses. So in order to effectively do my job, I have to do a lot of assessments and rubrics for online learning. They are very transferable over to any scenario, from a project management standpoint to a post-learning evaluation standpoint. There's a lot of ways to use all of these.
Okay. It looks like that's the last question we had. Audience members, again, if you'd like to reach out to Connie, please do so. We encourage you to reach out to her with any additional questions. Want to be respectful of your time today. And before we wrap up, just a reminder that all month long we do have Project Management Appreciation Month going on with different webinars. Tomorrow we have a session on how your technicians can move into a project management position, and as project managers, how you can support them in that transition. And then the following week really concentrates on improving communications between your operations and sales teams. Also for the owners that are on the call, don't forget to nominate your top project managers. We do have a grand prize giveaway at the end of the month. And everybody that attends the webinars throughout the month as well is entered for a gift card drawing. So we appreciate your time, and please attend the remaining webinars coming up. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Connie, or you can contact the PSA Project Management Committee as well. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Connie, for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.